Okay. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. It's Thank you for joining today's workshop. It's a real pleasure to welcome Professor Alex Gantman today. Alex leads security engineering, or he teaches at UC San Diego this quarter. He's in the industry. Alex leads security engineering at Qualcomm at a truly massive scale across billions of devices, multiple industries, and globally distributed engineering teams. So the perspective he brings is not just theoretical, but deeply grounded in practice. Today's talk is particularly interesting for us because it challenges something many of us is interested studying, advancing, and relying on metaphors and analogies. For me personally, this is also a quite meaningful and interesting topic. About 15 years ago, when I was thinking about how to build national level cybersecurity statistics, Dan is on this call, but Dan Gear pointed me to public health as a reference point. And a few years later, a few years ago actually, I met Adam Shostak, who was exploring a similar vision. And that's where the idea of cyber public health really started to take shape for us. So I am especially looking forward to exploring where analogy helps us move forward and where it might quietly lead us astray. So, Alex, with that, thank you very much for making time to join us. The floor is yours.
Uh, Thank you, Yuri. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me, folks. I uh, have kind of great, I guess, affinity for the work of the Institute. I share a lot of um, concerns about lack of outcome measures and, the need for objective outcome measures and outcome statistics like what we have in other fields, to bring that capability to cybersecurity. Uh, but today I'm going to talk about a related topic, but somewhat different, and that's the faults in our metaphors. And I don't mean by this kind of how metaphors are not perfect, and there's always something in the source domain that doesn't quite fit the target domain, and something in the target domain that doesn't quite uh, corresponds to everything in the source domain. Like that's a given, like no analogy is ever perfect. I'm talking about where we go wrong when we actually do come up with a useful analogy. Um, but first, oh, and by the way, so I think I plan for about 35 minutes of content, so there should be plenty of time for discussion afterwards. Uh, uh, I would request that folks held their outrage or applause until the end, and then we can dig into and you can throw tomatoes or virtual tomatoes or whatever my talk. But anyway, how this talk came to be. I was some time ago, maybe 2 years ago or so, I was talking to a colleague in the industry, another security expert. Um, and I don't even remember what the conversation itself was about, something, something, something. And I threw in kind of, oh, co-evolution of attack and defense. And, it's one of these um, kind of metaphors that we throw in casually without necessarily thinking about it too much or what it means. We'll talk about security debt, we'll talk about, defense in depth, kind of with a very loose kind of general meaning. And but for some reason, kind of this phrase stuck with me, right? And it's definitely it's not a new metaphor. It's been, we use it quite casually a lot, but something about it didn't quite sit right with me, and I kept turning it over and over in my head, uh, like what's wrong here? And what I realized eventually was that the notional purpose of the metaphor is to present a topic that's new and poorly understood, in terms of a topic that's more familiar and better understood, right? Like it's to make something more accessible, more familiar, more understandable. But I don't know anything about evolution. Like I took a biology class in high school 30 plus years ago, right? I have no reason to suspect that the person I was talking to knew anything more about biology than I did. We were both experts in the security field. So why did we feel it was helpful to us to take this discussion from a domain where we're both experts, map it to a domain we knew nothing about, and expect that somehow we made ourselves clearer and improved our understanding, right? Um, and that's what I kept turning over and over in my head. So my initial thesis was that a lot of times we fail to learn from metaphors because our understanding of the source domain, in this case, biological coevolution, is too limited or entirely wrong, right? So I made this analogy, like many others. They say, hey, attack and defense co-evolve like predator prey, let's say. Um, but since I don't know anything about predator-prey coevolution, uh, what lessons I draw from that analogy are likely either entirely wrong or at least I certainly left a lot of knowledge on the table, right, by not actually understanding what I was comparing it to. And I decided to actually, to spend a bunch of time to dig into this. And that's the course that I taught last quarter at UCSD that just completed. This is from the course description. And essentially looking at some of the metaphors we make in cybersecurity, um, and see what we learn if we actually go and study the source domain subject in a bit more depth. If we actually go and read about coevolution, if we read about debt, if we read about structural engineering and aeronautics engineering, about healthcare statistics and so on, uh, or safety outcomes, how would our use of these metaphors change? So then I started reading, right? And I read a bunch of books on kind of on theory of metaphor and again on biology, on economics, on engineering, um, on aviation safety. And then I read a bunch of papers. These are not all the papers, but it's a representative sample, again, across all of these domains. And it was fascinating. Like I enjoyed it tremendously. I learned a ton. Um, and the initial thesis is true. Yes, we do leave an embarrassing amount of information on the table. I feel, or at least I feel like I've been missing out on an embarrassing amount of information. Uh, and I don't leave the word embarrassing lightly here. More than once, I've kind of found myself with the feeling that could only be described as shame of, coming when I came across information that uh, I found hard to explain how as somebody who was 25 years in the field, didn't know this information and its applicability to cybersecurity. So yeah, so eventually, 18 months and a bunch of reading later, I actually ended up revising my thesis. So the original suspicion was wrong. Yes, we do leave a tremendous amount of information on the table and sometimes work with from flawed assumptions about what it is that we can um, take from another field. But there is a more important flaw, and that is we fail to treat these metaphors as hypotheses that still need to be validated, right? We draw the analogy, and then we assess the fit of the analogy purely based on its kind of rhetorical fit. And if we feel that the analogy works, we proceed as if we have proven that whatever patterns of relations hold in coevolution of predator-prey in biology, the exact same ones will hold in cybersecurity for uh, attack and defense. Now, backing up a little bit and talking about theory of metaphors, right? The very basic definition of metaphor, it's a mapping of concepts from a source domain, in this case, biology, to the target domain, in this case, cybersecurity. So we identify some elements um, with an interesting set of relations in the source domain, and we try to find a corresponding mapping in the target domain. Oh, this set of relations work in the source domain. I bet the same set of relations works in the target domain, right? And ideally, these are kind of higher order relations or relations among relations and so on. And there are many great uses for, and a lot of value from a good metaphor, right? They generate creative insight, they facilitate understanding, they help communication across experience boundaries. That last one is particularly compelling in many cases. But there's a limitation, and that is there's no way to look at a metaphor or any analogy and to determine that, yes, it holds purely theoretically, right? Purely on paper. You have to validate it in practice, through experimentation. There is no, logical, epistemological, metaphysical, scientific reason for why, an analogy of one domain to another domain is going to be correct. Fundamentally, a metaphor analogy is an attempt to map a model, to fit a model from the source domain onto the target domain. And models are based on like an infinite number of assumptions, right? Assumptions that turned out to be either true or insignificant in the source domain. And we can't say anything about the validity of those assumptions in the target domain until we actually test out and perform the experiments to validate this hypothesis. So, and that's the main point. The analogy is not equivalence, right? It's not like mathematical proof by reduction, right? It's not like, oh, I have a problem, I can reduce that, I have this computational problem. If I can reduce it to satisfiability, then I've proven that my problem is also NP hard. That's not how analogy works in these domains, and not how metaphor work, right? It can only help form a hypothesis, not assert a truth. Maybe I can, this is kind of my appeal to authority, right? It's not just my view, but kind of generations of philosophers and cognitive scientists and practitioners all kind of have asserted, hey, you have to be really careful. All you get is a spark of insight, and that's just the beginning of the work. All you get from a metaphor is a spark of insight. You can't determine whether it's correct or not without testing it, without experimentation, without empirical validation. And it is just as likely to lead you to a wrong result as to a right one. There's this interesting discussion of the difference in use of metaphors by kind of pre-scientific alchemists, right? Basically, I think pre-1600s, where there was a very heavy reliance on metaphor, but the metaphor was always kind of loose, unspecific, right? I think the example here is like associated by some path, right? So it's not a specific relationship that gets mapped. It's something vague. You can see in this picture, whereas in the previous picture, there was a one-to-one mapping between elements, right? Like A got mapped to A prime, B got mapped to B prime, C got mapped to C prime. Here, there's a many-to-many and in fact, the relationships tend to, or the mappings and relationships tend to shift depending on kind of how the argument flows. In contrast, again, kind of both the ancient Greeks and the post-1600 kind of more modern scientists, the metaphors became much more specific. And even then, all they did was generate a hypothesis, right? The metaphor did not carry any innate validity, so to speak, which is, I think, a big contrast to how I see or how many metaphors are used in cybersecurity, right? We will introduce a metaphor and we will convince ourselves that the mapping is reasonable or plausible or valid. And we proceed from that assumption to, the only open question remains is what do we do now? Kind of now that we've established that the mapping is correct, how should our policies How should our approaches change now that we've established that the mapping is correct, even though we've never actually validated that, again, the relationships that may have held in the source domain still hold in the target domain. And reusing a diagram from one of my previous talks that some of you may be familiar with. If you take out that step of validation from the scientific process, you essentially end up with pseudoscience, where you go from hypothesis straight to conclusion. Okay. So, but as I mentioned, I did find a ton of useful information um, when kind of when you dig into these other domains. I, don't have time to go over uh, a lot of it, and to be honest, I haven't yet quite synthesized my thoughts completely from all of this material. I still have to go through my notes and kind of organize it all, but I'll share some of the things that I've picked up. So first of all, a few overarching themes. Nothing is free. Like every field deals with trade-offs. In evolution, look, you want a bigger shell for protection, you're going to have to move slower. That's just how it is, right? Obviously uh, in immunity, in medicine, and finance, and in engineering. Um, in fact, one of the surprising things to me reading about civil and structural engineering is um, they really view themselves or they view their function more as coming up with the most economical design, not necessarily the safest design. Um, so this focus on kind of economy and trade-offs is much more explicit, much more upfront in other fields than I feel it is in cybersecurity. Let me explain what I mean more rational. Uh, I think it is more I don't know if acceptable is the right word. Let me give you a counterexample, for example. I guess I don't think outside of a few exceptions in cybersecurity or in computer security, we train our security engineers to say, hey, you know what? This is too much. Like this level of security is not worth it. You need to we should back off. I mean, it's what happens in practice. It's what industry inevitably teaches you. But it's something that we reluctantly accept. It's not something that we view as um, the core of what we do. Again, there are exceptions. I think in like applied crypto, if somebody was proposing, you know, 2000-bit symmetric key, my guess is any reasonable cryptographer would argue violently against it as being incredibly wasteful and inappropriate. But we see less of that, I think, in system security. Um, the other overarching theme is that pretty much in every field, reliability is achieved the same way. You fail and adapt, right? You expose the system to the elements, to the predator, to the adversary, to the environment, to whatever it is. You observe how it fails. You make some tweaks, and you see if the tweaks moved you in the kind of improved your survival odds or not, right? And that requires some sort of a reliable and ideally low latency feedback signal or outcome measure and so on. And I think that is one of the things that we lack in our field. And again, the topic that's central to this workshop is how do we measure outcomes? How do we get outcome statistics to know whether the interventions that we're introducing are improving overall outcomes or worsening overall outcomes? Oops, sorry. Yeah, okay, life sciences. So coevolution, because all of this started again with this throwaway reference to coevolution, and I figured, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go and I'm going to read a bunch about coevolution, and I'm going to know how coevolution actually works, and I'm going to be so much smarter than all of my other kind of security peers. So that when I talk about coevolution of attack and defense, I'm actually going to be able to use uh, uh, you know, the vast array of knowledge from biology about coevolution. Um, to my disappointment, biologists don't know much about coevolution either, as it turns out. I mean, it's not quite true. There's a lot of knowledge about coevolution, and I did learn a lot of interesting things, but unfortunately, nothing with predictive value. Uh, and yeah, so the current state of art or state of science in coevolution is that there is a model to predict every conceivable outcome of kind of predator-prey or parasite-host dynamics and interaction, uh, but no model that of any predictive value that can predict, given a starting point, how the system will co-evolve. Like, will the predator get the upper hand? Will the prey get the upper hand? Will they kind of reach some sort of a stalemate? Will there be a cyclical pattern or so on? No ability to predict any of it. And even models that are used for analysis are all incredibly simplistic. They all assume just like one species of prey, one species of predator, and they're in this exclusive relationship and nothing else. So that was a bit of a letdown. The other thing that comes across strongly from various life science papers, from coevolution, from immunity, and so on, is that there's no universal optimum. All right. Optimality is always relative to some specific context and environment. Because one example that I came across, I think, so cephalopods for 500 million years were evolving to grow bigger and bigger shells for defense and protection until at one point, um, uh, until basically reaching a tipping point, and they shed the shells entirely because kind of at that point, greater agility and speed of movement that they could gain without shells proved to be more efficient and I guess more optimal than being slower and with a more with a stronger defensive shell. Right. Uh, so what can be optimal protection or optimal security for one environment may be very different from what is optimal in a different environment. And along the same track, um, exposure builds resilience, right? It is, and that maybe goes back to the point that I made on the previous slide. There's only one way to build resilience, like fail and adapt, right? Which suggests that uh, no air-gapped system or no system that's kind of only exists in air-gapped form can ever be as resilient as an Xbox, uh, right? Just because it never, uh, if it's never exposed uh, uh, to selective pressure by attackers, it has no chance to really develop that resilience. Uh, But the thing that stood out for me the most in life science papers was the kind of the really awe-inspiring scientific discipline in both research and communication. It is the kind of the precision with which the claims are made is like reminiscent of the precision of Olympic athletic performances, right? It is nothing is overstated. Um, every kind of caveat is if it's a hypothesis, it's a hypothesis. It could be a hypothesis with like 80 years of experience of experiments behind it. In that case, the paper might go as far as to say, uh, you know, a long-standing hypothesis with, a significant amount of empirical evidence to support it, right? It never becomes, a law of nature or an obvious fact or anything like that, right? Um, and to go with that, empirical science, especially in very complex systems, is expensive and very time consuming. right? It's not unusual to read these survey papers that span decades or centuries of experiments and studies um, to establish a pattern of relations. Right? Um, and there is a lot to learn there. I think there are some interesting study designs that I think we can borrow from. In coevolution, for example, time travel, or what they call time travel studies, uh, were particularly interesting to me. So this is when they take specimens, let's say pathogen host specimens or parasite host specimens from different generations, from different time periods that were preserved. And then they kind of, in laboratory experiments, essentially play them off against each other to see if the parasite or the pathogen from newer generations does better or worse against older generations of hosts. Um, the closest thing to this that I've seen in cybersecurity is probably Dan Kaminsky's talk from CanSec West 2011 when he took versions of Microsoft and OpenOffice software from different years and subjected them to modern fuzzing tools to see how they did. But I think that this is a direction that I feel like we can explore a lot more to see how attack and defense, to analyze kind of actual patterns of attack defense coevolution. Okay. Finance and risk. So the main thing I took away from finance and risk, and this thing really kind of got into my head and I'm still pondering it. And this is probably the thing that I want to spend the most time reading about next and that's risk as likelihood times as the product of likelihood and impact is really a lie. And um, it's a thing that I've routinely used kind of this equation. I know it's pretty common in cybersecurity, but it was surprising to me, I guess, to see that finance has a very, very different, well, has a significantly different approach to it. And it's evident even from like undergraduate economics. Um, so let me give you an example. So in this case, 1 in 10,000 chance of losing $100,000, so 1 in 1 chance of losing $10, right? The expected loss in both cases is $10. My guess is, if Congress realizes that it needs money to pay for the war and it adds this new checkbox on the tax form, it says, hey, you either pay $10 now or you kind of you enter into this lottery where with the 1 in 10,000 chance you'll pay $100,000. I am fairly certain everybody picks like I'll just pay $10 now and not face the risk of $100,000, even though the expected loss is exactly the same. And by the way, although kind of psychological loss aversion may play a role here, I'm not even touching that right now. I'm talking like strictly even from a rational financial standpoint. There's a reason why paying $10 now uh, is a safer bet. In fact, I think most people would choose to pay $20, like twice the expected loss amount. I think even 100. 1,000 is questionable, but still possible. So then why would it be rational to pay more than the expected loss amount? And like if you've already guessed, that's essentially how insurance works. But before I get there, the key point is risk is not a point. It's a distribution. Like even if you have just one event that you're worried about, you still have at least two possibilities. Either that event happens or that event doesn't happen. So you at least have a distribution of 2 points. And more realistically, you have kind of a more, distribution with a larger number of points. But let's work with 2 points. And risk management is the practice of shaping that distribution. So it's not just moving the mean, the expected loss amount. It's about shaping the distribution and reducing the likelihood by 10 times has a very different effect on the distribution than reducing the impact by 10 times. There's one more thing that we have to factor in is then the cost of risk mitigation. Let's say if we're going to spend some effort in order to either reduce the likelihood or reduce the impact, we have to factor in that cost in the overall outcome. This goes back to the point that I made earlier, and that's in all of these other fields, cost of trade-offs is much more front and center. Okay, so let me give you this quick example. So let's say you're starting with $1,000, and that's another important factor, by the way. In finance, they don't look at risk in relative terms, right? So in this case, I'm looking at 50% chance of losing $400. So it's not just 400 that's important. The starting wealth is also important. And this has to do with the decreasing marginal utility of wealth, because, $100 when you're nearly broke has a very different utility than $100 when you're very well off, right? So your total assets matter when evaluating the significance of risk. Okay, so in this example, right, I have the probability on the y-axis, the net wealth on the x-axis. Sorry, probability on the y-axis, yeah, net wealth on the x-axis. So two possible outcomes. Either nothing bad happens and I keep $1,000, or something bad happens and I end up with $600. So now I face two options. Let's say I know how to decrease this risk by either cutting the loss magnitude or cutting the loss probability in half. And for simplicity, let's say that I can do either of these by, with $100 worth of effort or expenditure. So if I cut the loss magnitude by half, this is what I end up with. Now, if nothing bad happens, I end up with $900 because I had to spend $100 to decrease the risk. And if the bad thing does happen, I end up with $700 because now I only lose 200 instead of 400. So effectively, I decrease the variance of the distribution, right? Like the 2 points moved closer together. You'll notice also that effectively the way economists talk about this is wealth redistribution. I've effectively moved $100 from the good state to the bad state, right? This is kind of weird way of looking at wealth distribution, right? So I'm a little bit poorer in the case nothing bad happens, but I'm better off in case something bad does happen. Now, what if I cut the loss probability by half? It's a very, very different distribution. Now, again, if nothing bad happens, I end up with $900, and the probability of that goes up to 75%. But if something bad happens, I am now worse off. I end up with $500, even though it's rare. Notice that in this case, I'm worse off in both the good state and the bad state relative to the starting point, right? Even though the bad state is much less likely. The other thing is, and the numbers worked out that way, they don't always do, but the mean final outcome is exactly the same. On average, in all three of these cases, I still end up with $800. Which is why it's important to factor in, again, the cost of both the cost of risk mitigation and the initial wealth. Anyway, so this is something I don't know about the others. Viewing risk as this distribution of probabilities, and the job of risk management is not just merely shifting the mean, but shaping this distribution, right? So the mean is kind of the first moment of the distribution, but we have to be concerned with the variance, right? A lot of times, what insurance does is effectively it doesn't shift the mean, it just reduces the variance. So kind of focusing on reducing the variance. Skewness, like the third moment can also be important, right? How skewed the distribution is, and so on. So this is kind of definitely something that I want to spend more time looking into and thinking about and figuring out how it applies to security risks. Okay, safety engineering. By the way, two books that I ended up, or two of the books that I ended up reading on this domain here, Bill Addis's Structural Engineering and John Downers' Rational Excellence. Highly recommend both. I think John is actually here and online, so you should definitely buy a copy of John's book and read it. At the very, very least, if you don't have time to read a full book, you should read John's paper called The Aviation Paradox. So if you're at all interested in how reliability is achieved in complex engineering systems, and how our impressions of that might be wrong, highly recommend looking at John's work. Okay, so kind of one of the things that came across from reading a lot of the engineering literature is I think I got over my envy of other engineering disciplines. This sense that I have that they have a much better grasp on what they're doing than we do was largely dispelled. Um, Essentially, every field, when you talk to practitioners or people that study it, relies on to an incredible extent on intuition, and kind of calculations are more used to rationalize the intuition than to come up with an answer. What they do have, though, that we don't have is, like, again, they can measure outcomes, and that's something that we miss. One more thing. So this I actually came across a little bit, even prior to starting this particular dive into metaphors, but it was an interesting thing related to safety engineering. Most of you, I'm almost done. This is almost the last slide. Most of you are familiar with some form of this chart about kind of in the narrative about the kind of really incredible improvements in automotive safety, prompted by Ralph Nader's advocacy and regulations and NHTSA and regulations coming into play in the 60s and 70s. And even though everything on this chart is true, it is misleading in a fundamental way. It's misleading because of what it's not showing. And that is what this data looks like prior to 1960. So I took NHTSA data and I plotted it over this chart, but extended it back to 1920. So as you can see, kind of everything on this chart is true, like, there's a perfect fit of data. Now let me show it. This is what that same data looks like on a log scale. It is a straight line, like the best fit line has an R squared of 0.98. In fact, let me hide the years. I'm hard pressed to find on this line between 1920 and 2020 where we hit a sudden improvement in safety because of regulations or any other intervention. The process was remarkably consistent. It's just a logarithmic decay curve. Okay. Okay, getting to the end. One more surprise. There's absolutely a lot that we can learn from other fields, but this is the thing that remains a miracle to me. None of these fields can boast results that outshine ours. There's no other engineering field, or healthcare for that matter, that delivers reliability per hour of operation that can compete with a modern digital device, right? Especially if you consider that we place our devices in the hands of untrained amateur operators, unlike airplanes, that they're under direct exposure to highly resource-adaptive adversaries, unlike most buildings, and come at a price, functionality, and form factor of consumer goods. And that fact remains an enigma to me. I mean, it remains an enigma to me as to how this came to be, especially since we're missing this feedback loop of outcome measures. And with that, I'm happy to take questions or virtual stuff thrown at me. I will leave you. I'm a security engineer. I can't quite leave the talk on an uplifting note, so I'll end with the depressing quote from Nancy Levison from '92, which is depressingly as valid today as it was, 35 years ago. And I'll kind of open up the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex, for your provocative talk. Um, this is amazing. When I'm ready, I don't know, it takes so much time for me to digest everything. But taking from this so far is that metaphor may spark insight, but without validations and outcome measurement, it can just easily harden um, into false confidence. I would love to hear reaction from others. Um, Open to this to floors. Any comments, questions? What is landing most strongly for audience?
So,
Um,
do you want us to raise our hands or how?
sure, go ahead.
Jumping,
Yes, jump in, please.
just jumping in. First off, thank you. Really, really appreciate how clearly you synthesized thoughts and intuitions I've had, and I think others on the that are here today have had. I'm actually really struck by your final comment about how reliable the landscape we're currently operating in is compared to other domains of engineering. And I'm trying to wrap my head around the way to think about the uh, system of systems of systems of systems approach that we have today in the digital, in sort of this digital landscape, and where the way you mapped reliability and thinking might work and might break within that, if that question made sense.
So let me see if I understood that correctly. So I think um, so the reliability claim that I made at the end basically applied to a single um, object. So, like, hey,
Right.
like a single computer is more reliable, or let's say a single cell phone per hour of operation is more reliable than an airplane, for example. But as you're saying, we have we're not relying on single devices. We're relying on kind of systems of devices. And how do we think about the reliability of the system of systems overall? I, yeah, I mean, very valid. Yes, I have like, that analogy there obviously breaks down. I still would like to um, maybe I still think our outcomes have been remarkably good. In fact, and maybe that is what's leading to the difficulty of reliable measure of outcomes. I know that there's a little bit of a circular
Right.
paradox in there, and that is it's basically because the problem is not big enough,
Mhm.
because it is costly to measure outcome, to gather these statistics. And when you look at fields that do it, it is because they measure failure in thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds, in millions of lives lost per year, right? And it is worse to spend a lot of time to prevent millions of lives lost a year, right? Our failures are not on that scale, right? We've worried for a long time that they may be, and we're still harboring kind of fears that that may still come. But in all of these other fields, like all of these capabilities, like all of these interventions and capabilities came only after kind of those harms have materialized, right? And like we're still measuring our losses in dollars, and not even huge amounts of dollars, to
Right.
be honest, right? And yeah, so it doesn't even come close to um, uh, kind of the risks that these other fields deal with. I mean, that was my other takeaway. It's kind of, we should kind of get over ourselves a little bit. It's our problems are a lot smaller than problems from these other domains, which is like it's a good thing. And again, it wasn't an obvious given, right? Like, if you see where a lot of kind of, like Nancy's paper from 92, right? Like the late 80s and the early 90s um, kind of were a time when this is like shortly after, let's say, third 25 and so on. And we're worried that increasing adoption of computers and computing technology in safety critical uh, 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 places and in medicine and nuclear power plants and in fly-by-wire and airplanes and so on is will ultimately lead to the situation where, again, yes, like hundreds of thousands of lives a year are attributed, or death a year are attributed to computer flaws. uh, but yeah, somehow we seem to have avoided that. But I see other hands, and maybe folks will disagree with me violently on that.
Shall we go with William? He raised hands first, and then after. Is that a relating question?
Yeah, so I'm gonna follow on. I definitely think the measurement is probably the most important thing. So you orient yourself, whether you can take action on the measurement is something else. The measurement is not always easy. But I think the other key element is root cause analysis. And that's without root cause analysis, you don't know what to do with the measurement. So you have a problem, you have to find out what the problem is. And um going back to Nancy Levinson, there's different levels of accident. Like, the accident, what was the cause of the accident? Well, the plane crashed into the ground. Okay, well that, no, it's because the pilot had something, or no, because of the software and the system caused the pilot, you have to go different levels. And the kind of analysis that she's done really is um, Nancy Levinson and John Thomas and MIT is filtered into the National Transportation Safety Board. So it's both of the examples you used were transportation examples. So it shows the impact of root cause analysis. So I just had to say I make sure you include that. The problem is if you don't have the right measurements, you can't do the root cause analysis. So it's a sort of a tough problem. But if you get both measurements and root cause analysis, then things can happen. Okay, that's all.
Thanks, William. I think so. Root cause analysis gets tricky, and I'm hoping John will chime in here as well, because it's and actually I think measurement is not necessarily. Yeah, I'm trying to think about the relationship of outcome measures and root cause analysis. Uh, Essentially, outcome measures tell you whether your root cause analysis was correct or not, right? It because you can do the analysis. Um, I think there's this quote from Henry Petrosky. There is no way to prove the correctness of any engineering um, uh, hypothesis in a strictly mathematical sense, right? So you can do a root cause analysis. You can think you found the root cause, uh, but until you've applied the fix and seen that applying that fix led to better outcomes, you don't know that you've actually found the root cause. There's also the whole thing about kind of if you look at like if we're going down incident reporting threat, if you look at the literature on incident reporting in both aviation and uh, healthcare, they actually try to move away from or kind of pivot away from root cause analysis because root cause analysis tends to be kind of more focused on fault finding and rather kind of they look at systemic issues um, that lead to this mistake being made and how they need to be addressed. But yeah, this is probably a good time to cede the mic to John.
Yeah, hi Alex. Yeah, I'm reluctant to weigh in on root cause analysis. I agree with you on all of that. Um, yeah, no, I had a broader point. If people are okay with me changing direction, I don't know if anyone's got something else they want to add to. All right. Yeah, super interesting project. As I've got loads of thoughts, and I guess I'll Yeah, I have to write you an email when I sort of sorted them out in my head. The thing that's kind of top of mind at the moment is this question of when metaphors begin, right? Because all knowledge on some level, it occurs to me, is the projection from one domain to another, right? If it's a test onto the real world, if I come up with ideas about co-evolution by looking at fish and then apply it to elephants, I've kind of moved domain. And then if I apply it to corporations, I've moved domain again. So what makes a metaphor? Where does metaphor begin and just the normal sort of extension of knowledge to new domains kind of end?
Oh, you're taking it way outside of my domain of expertise, John. It's, I guess, yeah, my understanding is, and kind of in cognitive science, it's there's a range of use, right? So right. So I think like there's a Lockoff and Johnson, right? Like they'll claim like yeah, almost all thought and language is metaphorical, um, right? Like down to like, hey, or if I say, hey, are you feeling down today? Like that's a metaphor, like the spatial relationship of mood is like, hey, lower is worse, and so on. Like all of that is metaphorical. And yes, kind of the foundations of our thought are often seen as metaphorical. Interesting thing, by the way, for the kind of computer science folks on the call. Uh, so this, one of the books I quickly flipped, showed uh, this Lockoff and Johnson's Metaphors We Live By was a book that inspired Ward Cunningham to come up with the technical debt metaphor. Because, he read that book, he thought about metaphors, um, and there's lots of problem with that metaphor. So I think, okay, I'll give a little bit more context here. So as I was thinking about this, one thing that I couldn't find was a classification of intent behind the metaphor. So I came up with one, right? So I kind of had like 4 or 5 classes of intent, right? So it could be explanatory, right? Like I will use a metaphor when I'm explaining something to somebody that doesn't yet understand the domain, right? Like I'll explain something to a student, for example, and I'll use a metaphor. There is maybe related to that definitional. Sometimes we have a new concept, we invent a new thing, we need to give it a name. We give it a name from, from another domain. So in computer science, we have pipes, for example. I mean, we have a lot of things, but like, firewalls, pipes, etc. Memory, right? It's like all of these things, you can view them as metaphors. Now, we don't necessarily mean to imbue them with a lot of metaphorical meaning. We just need a term for the thing that we have in front of us, and we borrow this term. Now, they still have the metaphor still constrains us in some way. For example, like once we called it a pipe, we will view it as a pipe. Future enhancements of that technology will try to keep it as pipe-like as possible. Which is why, like, look, once we called it a virus, like, there will always be papers that try to calculate the R0 value of some malware. Like, whether that analogy fits or not, like, we called it a virus. Virus has an R0 value. We will try to measure the R0 value. Okay. Then there is I'm probably skipping something, but then there's a rhetorical, right? And this is like, Washington, D.C. is a swamp kind of thing, or, the thing that you make in a impassioned kind of a metaphor you use in an impassioned argument to try to get your point across and to try to get somebody to see the world kind of in a particular way. And then there is for lack of a better word, hypothetical, right? And that is where it's like, ooh, I wonder if, like, what if I compare electricity flow to flow of water, right? And that is what I mean, kind of, and that is a common scientific use of metaphor, but and this is where I'm saying all it gives you is a hypothesis, right? Now, the thing with those uses is kind of those are classes of intent, not classes of metaphor. Any one metaphor can function kind of in any of those intents, right? In fact, it probably does. So what really matters is what is the primary intent of the user of the metaphor? Are you just trying to convince or, to frame my thinking and to kind of get everybody to see the world the way you see it? Or are you or is this really kind of a creative spark of insight and you're framing a hypothesis? You're going that, oh, I wonder if the relationships that hold in this other domain also hold in my domain. How would I test if that was true? And that is how I hope we would be using more metaphors, but that is not the state of things today in cybersecurity. Largely, there are exceptions, but overwhelmingly we use our metaphors in a rhetorical way, like, "Hey, you can clearly see this analogy. It will be a fatal mistake for us to act as if this analogy, was not true." Okay. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I used up, but I kept running out the clock at least.
I mean, yeah, fascinating to sort of think about it that way.
I see some questions in chat. Let me
Right.
see. Mhm.
Question from comments from Art and excuse me.
So Art, so I think I replied, yeah. So I should have mentioned with the units here. The units were fatalities per mile traveled. So it's kind of normalized to some extent. And yes, you don't know why it is, right? Like that's the point. You don't know whether it was because the cars became safer or because, we're all better drivers than our parents were, right? And to some extent, as the user of the technology, I don't care. All I know is that traveling, a mile by car today is like 3 times safer than it was 40 years ago, which is not something we can say about computers today. Okay, and let's see, you relayed a question from Adam.
This is Adam Shostak.
Yeah, whether it's an inherent or emerging property. So I'm not quite sure how to interpret those terms. I mean, I do think it is emergent in the sense that we, like a lot of properties of very complex systems, we kind of don't know quite how to build it up from kind of first principles, maybe. It's also, I mean, one of the reasons to suggest that it's not inherent is what I said about optimality not being universal or objective, right? Whether system A is more secure than system B depends on the environment in which they're placed, right? And like what threats they're exposed to. So now, if you're comparing them against the same environment, I guess you could conceivably ask that question. Sorry, I'm trying to gather my thoughts. But I do feel like I was talking about principle design. Like this is another tangent that I would love to spend some time on, but kind of there's an interesting dilemma, right? Do we build complex systems based on first principles, or do we derive first principles by studying how complex systems work? Right? Because first principles have to come from somewhere. And I claim that that they come from studying how systems actually work. So you can use the principles we already have to build the systems that have already been built. But if we're extending, like if we're pushing beyond what's already built, if we're trying something new, I think we go back to what I said earlier. There is no, I mean, not this, but there is no approach other than fail and adapt. Try, fail, and adapt. Yeah.
We are passing a minute after we are supposed to close this workshop, but we have one more question from Dan as the last question. which is on the bottom of this chat, as a question. Is there anything yet to say about using AI to make decisions, frame knowledge, etc.? That would be the last topic.
Okay.
We'll close.
I did not really touch AI much, or I did not look into AI much in the course of this investigation. I used AI to help me understand some of the concepts. Like economics literature, for example, is incredibly dense. Like none of it is written for an external audience. Like, reading an economics paper, usually, it would take me 3, 4, 5 passes through the text before I could make sense of it. And AI definitely helps to break down the concepts
Alex,
yes.
Alex, this is Dan. What I was getting at is that AI effectively derives metaphors for us from reading text and so forth. In other words, that indirection. I doubt there's anything yet to say about it, but that's what I was asking.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. In fact, yeah, I was thinking about this question, like, is AI capable of coming up with a new metaphor, with a useful new metaphor? Uh, uh, I can envision it as being helpful, which is all the more important to treat it as merely a hypothesis. Because again, for every valid metaphor, I can come up with an infinite number of equally plausibly sounding, or rather, AI can much easily come up with an infinite number of equally plausible sounding but false metaphor.
Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance.
Yep, exactly. So we have to, which is why we have to be much more disciplined and careful about not attributing to metaphor more than what it is. It is a spark of insight, a possible thread to pursue. And wow, did I use a lot of metaphors there? But it is not a proof by reduction, right? It is not. It is not. No matter how plausible it seems, it is not an assertion of truth. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much all for the discussions. Alex, thank you so much. This was amazing discussion. We'll hope to be continued within this group. Hopefully, ready to be continued. Thank you so much.
Thank you, folks. Thank you again for inviting me. Thanks for the great discussion. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Have a great day.